Hey everybody, welcome back to Planet Coaster 2, and welcome to Rambukk. This is a new generation Vekoma launch coaster with a Norse theme. Now the name and the theme is something that I only thought of halfway through building this, but I really just wanted to build a new generation Vekoma launch coaster because these things are super cool. And just because I might have some new viewers around who are now just watching for the Planet Coaster 2 content, for those of you who are unaware, Vekoma is a Dutch roller coaster manufacturer, and they are historically known, or really infamous, for building really rough, horrible roller coasters. But in the last few years they've had kind of a renaissance, and their new generation launch model especially is very popular, and I've had the pleasure of riding a few of these, and they are really fun. Not all of them have launches, by the way. Some of them have lift hills as well. Some of my personal examples are Lech Coaster in Legendia in Poland, or Formula in Energylandia in Poland, but also Fønix in Fårup Sommerland in Denmark. And that last one was a big inspiration for this coaster as well. And what makes these coasters really fun is that they are super smooth, for starters. They are just really comfortable, although I have heard that Lech Coaster has been getting a little bit more rough in recent years, but it is what it is. But generally, these things are very smooth, and they also have a very interesting flow to them that I think is different from almost any other coaster. It's almost like you are just moving by gravity from side to side, like you're in a half pipe or something like that sometimes. The way that these coasters bank and do their elements is just very fun like that, and they'll often also have airtime hills that aren't entirely straight but have a bit of banking to them. You just kind of sway from side to side throughout the entire layout. Plus, and I think this is very fun as well, these things tend to be quite small. They do a lot in a very small footprint. They're usually not very tall, but they still pack in a lot of airtime and hang time and all of that good stuff. So very fun to ride in real life and very fun to build in this game as well. So I'm really glad that Frontier decided to add these in there. Though I do have a little nitpick, I kind of wish that you could put more cars on the trains, because this specific model is based on one in China, I believe. Could be somewhere else in Asia, but it's a Top Gun model, I think it's called, which is airplane inspired, which is why it only has 2 cars on a train. But most of this coaster model variations in the world out there have longer trains than that, so I kind of wish we could do that too. But for now, this is what we have, and at least we can play with this coaster model. So the layout was, again, built pretty quickly, I'd say, and a lot more quickly than I'm used to with Planet Coaster 1 as well. I think, for me, this coaster has really been the proof of concept that the coaster builder is hugely improved, and you're gonna notice that later in this video. But I didn't put that much effort into this layout, nor into the smoothing. It just kind of works. Although I did leave a lot of footage out there where I was meticulously going through the layouts for almost like an hour or so, I think, going back into different elements and reshaping some of them. Speaking of reshaping things, I'm also reshaping this coaster train, and right now I was experimenting with this weird, I don't know what kind of horned creature it is actually. I was thinking something like a fish, but I think it's just a slightly goofy dragon. But eventually I had to adjust the design, and I also did this off camera because it took a lot of trial and error to get this right. But eventually I ended up with a more slick looking storm ram kind of vehicle, which is also how I came up with the name for this coaster. It's basically a battering ram in Norwegian, and that is the general theme for this ride as well. It's not as densely themed as some other rides could be, but that's also based on the inspiration. None of these coasters in real life tend to be super densely themed, so I'm mostly just sticking to some fancy buildings and rockwork and foliage and all that good stuff. And speaking of that good stuff, I wanted to start with nothing else than the station, of course, which is going to be inspired by those Norwegian stave churches made out of wood, and lots of wood. And they tend to be really fun structures to build, and I think the Viking set in the game is really good for doing this kind of thing. So yeah, I am usually using sets in ways that you're not supposed to be doing, But right now, today, I am totally doing a Viking-esque build with this Viking set, because these pieces are just begging to be used in a building like this, and it's really fun, just the amount of different trims and decorations that you have. Also, all of the dragon heads that you can put on your roofs, which is what really makes this kind of architecture really fun. And I also took some specific inspiration from some of the modern reinterpretations of this kind of thing. You can find this with the name Dragon Style Architecture. It's basically a more 19th century revival style based on these old wooden types of architecture. And they're really cool. They kind of combine some of the intricacies and details of Swiss chalet style architecture with this Nordic stuff. I'm definitely not an expert on this, but definitely look it up if you're interested into this kind of thing. Or if you're just looking for inspiration for your Viking theme builds in this game, because I think you can definitely take a lot of inspiration from the dragon style. And it also has to be one of the coolest names out there for any kind of architectural movement. It just, I guess, refers to the dragons on the roofs. That's just a guess. I didn't research it that much. But it's really cool nonetheless. So, as one tends to do with these kinds of buildings, it's gonna be layered with a bunch of different layers, each having their own dragon heads and their own gables. So it took me quite a while to make this station, way too long actually I think, to get all of these roofs on top of each other, and especially to get the composition right as well. Because when I was recording this time-lapse I tried not to move too much, but I did notice that the shape of the station was a bit too top-heavy, so the shape that you're looking at right now is gonna get redone a few times, most of which are off camera. But the general details are gonna stay in place. Every time I tried reshaping the building, I just took some of the gables and roof pieces and put them together in a slightly different way, or just moved them into the building a little bit to make the composition seem a little bit less top heavy, because this is quite bulky. But this is also where I think the really cool elements of the Viking set in the game come into play, because there are so many cool trim pieces and ways to decorate your roofs to play with, that I think this set ends up being very versatile. Not just for this kind of architecture, but probably also for Victorian or Alpine or the Swiss chalet style as well. I think you can do a lot with these pieces, but of course it's very well suited for this kind of thing as well. It's also funny that I hardly recolored any of the wooden pieces, like the posts and the trims and beams and everything, because they just have the right color from the get-go in the game, so really why bother changing them? I did change these wooden wall pieces a little bit, which is interesting because they have a texture with 3 colors, but none of those colors are the main color on the wall, so you're never gonna get up with you're never gonna end up with a very different color, but you can always slightly change it. So that's something I did do every now and then. And now we get to the most fun part of this building, or any building really, which is the spire on top of it, which is also going to have a few of the simple gables, and then underneath that a little bell tower kind of structure. I don't think this, actually I do think this would be a bell tower. No, this is just in these kind of churches, typically the place where you have the bell tower. And it's something which sometimes in real life you find also has a straight spire, which unfortunately I don't think we can do those in this game yet. Well, you can, but you'd have to make your spire out of wooden shingles completely on your own with hundreds of pieces, which I'm not going to do quite yet, partly because it takes a lot of effort and partly because I still want this building to be blueprintable. But I do hope that in some future editions or updates we'll have some spire roof pieces as well, because it's something that's sorely lacking in this game at the moment, and especially for Viking builds like this, you'll always have some spires on top of the church or the side of a building. It's definitely going to make all of the building sets a lot more versatile. At least we do have some really cool decoration pieces to put on top of this. So I put a bunch of different posts together into a fancy decorative finial and put that on top of the building as well. And at this point I just kept looking at the station and thinking I could add more detail, and I just kept adding things here and there. I didn't even have footage of all of it because I kept going back into this thing and adding little things everywhere basically. So that's a process that's gonna take quite a while, and then I don't have all of the footage for, but again, I think many of the trims are super useful for this kind of things, and you can also use the roofs to make small gables like this basically, and use the wooden roof frame decorations to make decorations outside of that. So with a bit more work I was able to finish the station, and I'll show you later what it turned into exactly, or you can check it out for yourself of course on the blueprint. But for now I'd like to move forward with something else that I found really fun to build, which is the queue-line bridge. Now, when I finished this layout and I put my entrance on the other side of the station, I realized that I put myself in quite a pickle as to where to put the queue line, because the track is so close to the ground, because it's such a small coaster that still has a relatively long layout, that there was no place to put the queue line underneath the track anywhere. So eventually I just had to settle with the queue line having a bridge to go over the brake run, which I think actually kind of is an improvement over just having a simple queue line that runs underneath the coaster. I guess it's one of those things where you're forced into a corner and a fun idea actually comes out of it. So taking this bridge idea, I figured I would have to decorate this thing quite a bit and really make it fit in with the station and use a similar but not entirely same architecture. So this is our little covered bridge, which is hopefully also going to be a nice place in the queue to wait, since it has a really cool view of the coaster, I think. I'm always thinking of queues in the sense that you spend probably most of your day in queue lines when you're visiting a theme park and you're just doing rides. And when queues are boring, it's just really annoying. You should always keep in mind that whenever people are in your park, be it in a queue or in a restaurant or whatever, you want to keep the theme going and you still want to entertain them. And especially me as a coaster nerd, I want to have my places in the queue, preferably where I can take pictures of the coaster as well. Some of those nerd pics with close-up shots and things like that. And I think this bridge over here with the lookout over the launch in the distance and almost all of the elements of the layout is one of those cool places where I would probably hold up the line when I'm standing there, and I'd have to wait just a bit to see the coaster pass by at a perfect place. But, you know, usually that doesn't matter too much, but we are almost at the end of the line here, so maybe I shouldn't hold it up too much. But yeah, that's basically it for this part of the queue. Now, the rest of the queue is gonna be a little bit more simple, although it was, again, also a journey of exploring the new path tool, because, well, I hadn't figured out quite everything with it yet, and I figured out that when you use the traditional path tool, at least that's what they call it, and you make a very lengthy section, and then you use shift to lower or raise the path, you can make super gentle slopes. So, well, it doesn't really matter because we do have a staircase right behind it, so it's not like this queue is wheelchair friendly, but they don't have to be because we have the exit for that, and I made sure to make the exit wheelchair friendly. But overall, it's really nice to do paths like this to make sure that your slopes don't become too intense. If you're thinking of these kinds of things, you don't really want to exceed 5%, I believe. Something along those lines. There are all kinds of actual regulations along what slopes of paths you can have to be accessible to people in wheelchairs or with otherwise mobility issues. But yeah, I don't want to get too much into that. But let's just say that every Planet Coaster 1 park was not very accessible. And it's at least something that hurts the realism a little bit, because it is something that real life theme parks have to think of a lot. And even if you don't necessarily see it as a, regularly able-bodied guest, it's something that does affect the general way that a park is designed, and obviously also how a large part of the demographic is visiting a park. So yeah, hooray for this path tool, I guess. I did also fight a little bit with the path tool to make that back and forth cattle pen that you see in the top right there. I was busy talking about wheelchairs when that was happening, but basically you can adjust your paths after you've already placed them, and you can use that to change the shaping, including making straight cattle pens with the Q-line tool. It's a little bit iffy and annoying to work with, but it does work, and it is pretty cool. So there's a small tip for you. Next up, I wanted to work on the transfer track for the storage facility of the coaster, and I didn't go all out on this thing. I was contemplating maybe putting in some mechanics and stuff like that, but eventually I figured I'll just keep it simple, not go too over the top. But basically we have a small transfer track and then another track that goes into a little shed, which is the maintenance shed for this coaster really. A small touch of realism because this thing does run 2 trains, because with small trains like that you can't just have 1 train. The operations would be absolutely horrible. So there's that, and I think it's a fun opportunity as well to add a bit of theming. So besides the bridge, we are gonna have that building over there, which unfortunately I don't have a recording of. It's not like the other things which I haven't recorded, because most things are just really finicky or just me messing around with pieces a lot. In this case, I just forgot that my hard drive was completely full, so I was totally thinking that I was recording, but my PC was just full of Planet Coaster footage and couldn't record anymore. So unfortunately, we lost a brave soldier there, but basically you can see the building in the back there, and I'll show it off a little bit on the real-time section as well, just to get a better idea of what it's like, because quite a bit of effort did go into it, so it's a bit of a shame that the building process is gone, but I'll just showcase some of the interesting tidbits. Speaking of interesting tidbits, here is my little accent, if you will, of a building on the exit path, because for some reason that path just seemed too straight and too boring and too straight to the point as well. So this little cupola of sorts, or pavilion, is just the thing that I felt it needed to give an extra point of interest, and also it's almost like I don't know, like that meme of don't talk to my wait, what is that meme again? Don't talk to me or my son ever again. You know, when you have a building that's big, and then you have a small building right next to it that is basically the big building but small. This is a horrible sentence. Anyway, that's what I was thinking when I was building this little pavilion right next to it. And then, and this video is all over the place, I had to do some custom supporting, because I noticed that there were quite some places where the coaster wasn't supported. And for some of them, it's because I removed the supports because they didn't look very good. At least I think that's what happened over here, because the game only spawned a support in the middle of this. Well, is it a 0G roll? I guess it is. And that support just looked a bit strange and unrealistic, and not like the kind of thing that Vekoma would usually do in a place like this. So I had to come up with my own supports for this thing, because the other supports that spawned disappeared because of the track right underneath it. And as you can see, I struggled a little bit figuring out what kind of support I would place here, but eventually I ended up with this, and I think it works well enough. And I'd say that goes for the custom support pieces in this game in general, because I am just using the slide supports here and scaling them up a little bit to fit the coaster track, but it's not exactly perfect, and it's also not exactly identical to the supports that are in-game. But I do feel like if you don't pay too much attention to it, you don't really notice that the supports are not meant to do this. So eventually I'm fine with it, I think, but it was a bit of a hassle. Especially the connector piece, because that connector piece is entirely made out of art shapes, and the art shapes are tiny and take quite a bit of effort to work into a functioning support. And then there were some other parts in the layout where the game just randomly decided not to support them, but I do see a bit of a trend in these parts. I think it's because of the banking, because these are very steeply banked curves. But then again, it is a little bit of a hassle to place these supports myself, but they look alright enough, and I think when you don't pay attention to it, you don't notice that they are extra supports, but it is interesting. It was very fun to work on this middle support though, because I thought to myself, how am I going to support this roll? And I didn't record the whole clip because the rest of the clip was a lot of very finicky figuring out which beams work for it. But trust me, eventually I found a beam that works and connected the middle support of that coaster to 2 in-game supports that already existed there, which was a fun little support mission. Now, finally, it's time to do some of the surroundings of the coaster. And for the general terraforming, because this is a blueprint, I decided to not do any actual terrain, but just keep sticking to the mossy rocks, because these mossy rocks are really good looking. And I think they also very much fit the taiga theme here. And I'm just putting these in a bunch of random places where the coaster isn't going, and where I have space for it. Also because I thought to myself, it's gonna get too complicated if I cover the footers of the supports and we have supports going through scenery. This park probably just went for the cheaper option and put the supports out of the way of the scenery. So that's what I'm doing here as well. It's really just a filler in between, and also fun places to place foliage, because I'm filling the rest of the spaces in with a bunch of gravel and rocks and mud, which is not really the kind of usual thing that I go for when putting stuff in the middle of a coaster. But in this case, I think it's just the right contrast for the mossy rocks and all of the foliage that will be on top of that later. And it also fits the theme and just the idea that maybe this is also a relatively newly built coaster. So we don't have any large trees around it. We don't have a lot of dense shrubbery around it, and maybe not all of the grass has grown yet. Instead, it's still a little bit barren and filled with very small foliage. So that's it for most of the rock work. Then I went to this entrance plaza, which is something that I won't be including on the blueprints, but I built in this case to at least get an idea that this could be somewhere in a bigger park, and also have an idea of what that surrounding could look like and how it could match up with the coaster. You always want to have these paths, I think, in certain directions to make sure you have a sight line when you're walking toward the coaster of interesting buildings and stuff like that. And my main sight line in this case was this place, where I was trying to hide the transfer track a little bit, but also putting this in a generally cool position with a logo for the coaster. And I didn't want to put too much effort into this, so it's relatively simple, just a bunch of 3D letters and then some bigger 3D letters right behind it to get a sort of shadowy texture, and also eventually a Viking shield to at least have some interest behind it as well. So nothing too complicated, but it is, I think, strategically the place where you walk toward the coaster and you first see this little sign in the center of your vision, basically explaining to you where you are now. So that's that. I also went to some fences on the side here, which is a fun combination between the in-game fence, which I eventually turned on here because curvy paths are a little bit annoying to fence up. But I did combine them with a few in-game fence pieces, these little stone fences that we have in the Viking theme, because I think they combine really well with the actual basic generic path fences like this here. You have this small stone wall and then a wooden railing, which is a little bit on the low side if we look at the coaster, which is right behind it. But this is probably somewhere in Western or Northern Europe, so I'm not too concerned about protecting guests from the coaster. They'll hopefully have common sense not to walk into this area, because around these parts you'll typically find that large coasters don't have huge protective fences or things like that preventing people from going into the ride area. And then of course it's also time for a little bit of street furniture, some benches and picnic benches at some of the best spots to look at the coaster from, because you want to make sure that people can also find some places to rest in your park, and preferably with a view as well. And then I put these stone rune things, because they have runes on them as well, around the launch track, which was an idea that I randomly had when I was scrolling through the pieces and thinking of other ways to decorate this whole part. And I'm not sure how well these fit into the story, but they were very fun to work on. And I also put some other rune pieces here and there as a little sort of subtle hint toward whatever this very mysterious battering ram that this coaster is themed after could be. This actually reminds me that isn't Terran some sort of battery ram-like thing? Battering, I should say. Either way, that's that for that little theming. I also put some random clutter in the middle of the queue line because there isn't that much scenery to look at in the queue line, and my main idea for this queue going where it's going is also to look at the coaster and not really any specific theming, but having some clutter here and there definitely helps sell the theme a little bit more than just keeping it all barren. So that's what I'm adding there. And then finally, it is time to make this map look like it's actually somewhere in a very forested theme park. Again, my inspiration there is very much Fårup Sommerland, which is right in the middle of a huge forest. It's one of the most green theme parks I've ever been to, probably. And it really adds to the charm of the park and also the Nordic atmosphere of it. So I am using a custom scenery brush here. And those scenery brushes are really fantastic. I think they are kind of an underappreciated feature of the game, and maybe that's just in a general sense. I'm sure many people are really appreciating this thing, but I'm not seeing that many conversations about it. But I think it's huge for trying to do simple single builds like this and making sure that you have all of your foliage around it, but also for doing ground shrubbery. I made a brush for the trees, but also for the ferns that are on the forest floor, to get a realistic looking forest, unlike in Planet Coaster 1, where I usually put very dense trees way too close together to make it look like there's actually a big forest out there when there really isn't. But in this case, it's pretty easy to actually do it realistically. So pretty cool. And that basically also rounds up this build. So let's take a quick look in game and see what it looks like. Well then, here we are in game, and look at this thing. I don't want to take too much credit for how this thing looks, because mostly for me this was a trial for the coaster builder and overall look of this game when it comes to building coasters that aren't heavily themed and really just focusing on the layout itself and just how it looks as a coaster going around. And I think, I mean, look at that roll. That is so good. And I really don't want to take too much credit for this. This is relatively simple, made out of large pieces. There are no crazy mods or 2-meter method shenanigans going on. And I can show you, because I do want to give this tip. Take, for example, this roll, and I think this is the best moment on this coaster that is also very different from what Planet Coaster 1 would have looked like. This thing is made out of basically just 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces, and what I did is just built these pieces, all 5 or 6 meters long, just bank each one 60 degrees with a banking offset of 2 meters, and after that I did a smoothing job like this, basically taking 2 pieces and going forwards and then going backwards, and maybe you need to do that process twice per layout or per element, maybe 3 times, maybe just once more. But in any case, that's it. Just a few minutes of work in that sense. It's relatively easy. So that's how I did this entire layout, and that's why this, for me at least, is a proof of concept that the coaster builder in Planet Coaster 2 is definitely a big improvement over Planet Coaster 1. It's not up to no limits or anything like that yet for the real coaster nerds out there, but I think it is impressive in a sense that you can very quickly, without much effort and without needing to know too much about roller coasters or shaping, pump out some relatively realistic and smooth layouts. So I think that's huge, and I think that's just what a game like this needs. So I'm super happy with that, and I think it looks great with the lighting as well. I don't think this color scheme would have looked anywhere near as good on Planet Coaster 1 either. So there's that. And here's my little overview of the coaster. I'll leave you guys with a cinematic overview and POV of the coaster. And I'd like to thank you for watching this video. Go check out the blueprint if you want to check it out for yourself. I'll upload it to the Frontier workshop. And hopefully I'll see you somewhere in the next blueprint build or park or whatever it may be. Take care, everyone.